Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Empowering Women podcast. This is the third episode in our series on gender wealth equity. Our first two episodes were absolute must listens. So if you've not already checked those out, please go do that. And I am thrilled to continue this engaging conversation with another fabulous guest. So Amy Westbrook, she is a certified life coach and professional wealth coach. She uses her corporate background in neuroscience, and she's developed various innovative neuropsychological tools and high-performance strategies to help ambitious professionals get out of their own way, like me, to achieve extraordinary success faster, easier, and on their own terms. She was also one of the original coaches on the Capital One Money coaching team. So I think she is the perfect person for this third episode in this series. So welcome, Amy, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about these important topics.
Yep, absolutely, especially for women, which is a little bit of my bias. So my favorite part of being a podcast host is really learning about our guest stories. So that's where I always start on the outset of the podcast. So tell our listeners a little bit about your story and what brought you to where you are today.
So I was the girl that got good grades. I went to a good school, got a good job, and started making good money right out of graduate school, actually. And they moved me to Colorado. I was working for a pharmaceutical company, and I enjoyed the work. I mean, I got to travel a lot. It was engaging. So it lit my fire in a lot of ways. But as I stuck with it, just something was missing for me. And I knew that there was more. And it was interesting because I started volunteering to read books, and I would put together these trainings, and they'd be like, "Oh, this is fantastic. Would you mind teaching it to like the entire account management team, in the nation?" And I'm like, absolutely. And I just thought, gosh, it's so funny that I'm doing all of this other work to kind of get away from my job. So the job was great. It taught me how to do sales. I think it's a fundamental skill that every person needs. But yeah, when I noticed that, it just sort of lit a fire in me that I needed something more. I was looking for something more. And really what precipitated my change into becoming a coach was I was traveling a lot. And I know there's a lot of there's movies and stuff around people that do pharmaceutical sales. Where was that glamorous life? I didn't get to see that really. But yeah, we were having layoffs like almost every single year. I mean, that's really stressful, sometimes twice in a year. I went from having a team of like 50 people down to 2. And my goals didn't drop. I mean, I still had to, outperform last year's goals. So it was so stressful. But yeah, the real turning point for me was when I was leaving to run to the airport again, and my 4-year-old son came up and he wrapped his arms around me and he was crying, and he just looked up, and he's got, big green eyes. Like, "Mommy, don't leave me." And I was like, wow, worst mom of the year. Great job, Amy. Yeah. I mean, I cried all the way to the airport, but I was telling my girlfriends about it that night. And, a friend said, "I've got a life coach right now. I think you should talk to her. I mean, you seem pretty unsettled." And I'm like, man, I've been unsettled for a while now. So yeah, I got a coach, and she's like, "Why aren't you coaching and training and teaching? Like, that's what your passion is." I'm like, well, I couldn't see that for myself. Thank you. Worth every penny. So yeah, I got my certification in life coaching, started coaching people. And what was interesting is I have a real passion for money, and I started teaching myself how to invest. I taught myself how to buy rental homes. I taught myself how to be a good landlord. But what I noticed is people in my company, in my corporate job, were coming to me and asking me, well, how much house can I afford? How does the 401k work? So I was answering these questions and mentoring people all the time. And it just sort of dawned on me one day, why am I not folding that into my coaching practice? Because they really go together.
Yeah.
And, they say when you make a decision, the universe lines up behind you. Well, I made that decision. And a week later, a friend that I went through my coaching training with called me and said, "Hey, guess what? Capital One is hiring for a new money coaching team. You love money and you're a certified coach. Do you have any interest whatsoever?" And I'm like, "Are you kidding?" Yeah. So I did that for
You're
a
like,
couple of
okay,
years.
apparently the universe is now really
Yeah.
talking to me,
I,
literally.
yeah. I'm well, and I kind of come from a science background, being in pharma, but I didn't realize how spiritual I really was. But honestly, I mean, the universe did line up behind me on that. And I really haven't looked back. So I just made that decision that I wanted to help people with the personal development skills, but also with the money skills, because I think they go hand in hand. So that's really what landed me where I am today.
Yeah, they really do. I have to admit, I started this journey, and as I mentioned on the outset, we're on the third episode. And the first one was almost, I think, like a therapy session for me, because I made that connection of, okay, this is not just dollars and cents on paper. It's something much deeper, which actually I think I owe you, because it leads me into my first question, which is one of my biggest learnings on this journey is that money is actually more emotional than I ever gave it credit for. And as being an engineer, I wanted to see it as dollars on a page versus having some emotion behind it. So my question is, why do you think money's so hard to talk about, other than the fact that maybe some of us consider it taboo?
Well, you're absolutely right. And, to be fair, money really is just numbers on a page, but we assign meaning to it.
Mm.
And so you have to look at the meaning that you assign to it. And that's born from your past experiences, what your parents said about money, what your church said about money, what your community said about money, what your best friend thinks about money, and your own experiences. And a lot of us, we were not taught anything about money, and maybe you haven't done much with your money. You haven't made the money that you thought you would. You've been, and I'm using in air quotes, bad with your money, and you've made some bad decisions. And born from that is an interpretation. And that interpretation is shame, guilt, resentment, unworthiness. And you ask why we don't talk about it. Well, who really wants to put on a billboard their shame, embarrassment, mistakes? Look at social media. I mean, we post our pictures on our best hair days, right? When we look our best, feel our best, our biggest wins, you don't always see the struggle leading up to it. And so there's sort of this, you talk about it's taboo, but I think it's more than that. It's just people really don't air their bad decisions with money. They don't want to talk about money. And so, that was kind of a thing for me, is just normalizing the conversation, in women normalizing the conversation, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think one of the craziest facts that I saw when I first started this journey was, I think it was in the early 70s. Up until that point, like a woman who didn't have a man to co-sign for a credit card could not get a typical major credit card, which absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that to me, in the grand scheme of time, is the blink of an eye.
Oh, it is a nanosecond. And, that's, probably another part of it is we don't even have the language really to talk about money. I'm really into the brain, and money is a new thing for our brain as well. So it's, we have a spot in our brain, the back of our head, that's our vision. Our front of our brain is where we make those executive decisions. And so we really don't have a compartment, if you will, that is dedicated to money. So it's lumped in with the other, reward pathways. And so it's sort of viewed in our head as, like food or safety. And so that's why we have such a strong emotional reaction. I mean, it's visceral. Yeah.
Oh, it really is
You
visceral.
lose
I never
the
thought
money,
about
it
that.
triggers
But it is.
danger, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you combine that with the shame you just talked about, who wants to put their shame, aside from me, apparently is a glutton for punishment, out here to the world, when it's connected to such a visceral, basic need?
It is.
To me, that's a pretty powerful thought.
It is, absolutely. But, I have to say that we are in a new age, and I sort of bag on social media, but there's a real opportunity for it as well, because people like you putting a podcast out there, having these conversations, or you start to follow someone on Instagram. And there's a lot of women out there that are documenting their journey on Instagram to get out of debt. They're like,
Yep.
I'm tired of this. And instead of sweeping it under the rug, and, this is kind of the nasty thing about emotions, is if we push them aside and we don't address it, that's really when it becomes a problem. So if there's shame and you're trying to, push shame to the side and like sort of pretend like it's not there, but it is, it really starts to eat away at your self-worth over time. So it's actually a downward spiral by not talking about it.
Yeah, it's like what I can't quote her right now, but Brene Brown talks about basically shame can't live in talk or conversation. The minute you start sharing it with somebody you trust, whatever that shame is, then it stops being as powerful as it was. So it's a great point. So how do you think we can build a community, especially women, around that conversation? And it could be a large community or a small one.
Right. Well, I think a couple of things, and I think it's a great question. And again, I just think that there is an opportunity in social media in that women can start to find their community. They can start to baby step inside of these conversations. Nobody's asking you to open up your bank accounts and show the world, where you're at right now, but you can start to participate in micro levels to your podcast. Everybody subscribe to the podcast and continue the learning journey, and that's one way to do it. I think another way is to just make a decision about what you really want, instead of focusing on the negative and, oh my God, I've made mistakes in the past. You can't feel empowered to move forward if you're focused in the past. And so it's making a decision that, you're going to stay present. This is where you have the opportunity to make decisions. This is where you have the opportunity to form habits, and be in that present moment and be clear on what you're working towards. I think as women, that's probably a huge part of the problem, is that we're not real clear on what wealth means to us individually. We subscribe to this American dream, or we subscribe to what we see on Instagram, and we're not real clear on our values and how we can align our values with our spending, our saving, and our investing. And so that's sort of a twofold, right? It's like, go find your community, but be clear on your values and what you're trying to work towards. I think because then you set an intention. And we were talking about the universe shows up for you. Set that intention.
Yep.
Let the universe present the teacher.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I would say, even if you're not super clear on your intention, that community can help coach you. I don't know is the right word, but they can help you ask questions to say, oh, well, what do you think about this? Or you mentioned this, and, you mentioned wanting to retire in, 10 years. Let's talk about that more. Like, what does that mean? What do you need to do? Like, they can kind of keep you focused forward.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and it can also point to what you don't want. It's funny, I'm in a lot of women's entrepreneurial groups, and, some women are out there and they're like, gosh, the faster I can make 10 million, the better. And some women are like, that's not really what I'm shooting for. I'm shooting for, I'd love to make $150,000 a year, but only work 10 hours a week and spend time with my kids because they're pretty young. So it's just deciding what wealth means to you. And again, I think that's the first step, is understanding, like, what are my values and what life do I want to create, and being intentional with that life.
Yeah, I think what you just tied for me is, it's not just you. This is sort of a theme that's tying through. It's sort of part of your development plan as a human, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It's integrated in with that, because if you say, to your point, if my priority is my family, regardless if you're working in corporate America or if you're working in an entrepreneurial space, that's going to have a huge factor on what wealth means to you.
Absolutely.
And what the outcomes of that are. And maybe your path would be very different from somebody who maybe they're single, and that's just at this moment in time. And so probably also you have to revisit those, because I believe life has seasons.
Oh, amen.
Right. So to your point, if you have younger children, your definition of wealth and your intentions may change, if once they get into high school and college, it may be a little bit different.
Absolutely. Well, and I think even from the get-go, we don't even give ourselves the opportunity. I mean, we start jobs when we're young. And I say young, I mean, we're in our 20s, maybe even
Right.
earlier. And I personally found myself, rushing through school, got out of grad school, I got my MBA, and then started a career and was really pretty busy inside of that career. And then I found myself, dating, and then I had a husband, and then I had a kid. It's just, I was moving so fast, and I don't even think I was that intentional. It's not like I sat down and did, thousands of hours of research and I knew myself and I said, okay, I'm going to go into pharmaceutical sales. No way. I mean, I wish I was that intentional. I wish I was that smart. I was not. I landed in this job, and, it taught me a lot. It was great. I'm glad I did it. But I just find that myself and a lot of women, like, we start climbing this ladder, and I climbed the ladder pretty fast, but I got to, the top of the ladder, and I looked around and I was like, oh man, like it's up against the wrong building. This is it. Bummer.
Oh, that's a great analogy. I climbed the ladder and it's up against the wrong building.
Yeah. I want to go over to that house,
Yeah.
But I wasn't intentional enough. Like I didn't know myself. I mean, if you would have asked me when I was 26, like, what are my values? What's your purpose? What's your mission in life? I mean, I just would have looked at you like, how am I supposed to know that? Are you crazy?
Yep. And it changes, because I think you raise your hand and you say yes to things, and then things start to unfold in ways that you would have never anticipated. So if you'd asked me, if you'd go back to my 22-year-old self that was starting out in my career, I would have said, no, you'll never be there. Forget about that. That's not happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, we talked a little bit about the brain earlier, but what role do you think the subconscious plays in wealth accumulation?
Well, and I think it's more than what people realize. I mean, I consider that there's several influences, if you will, of your thinking. And there's the easy stuff. It's, our external environment. We're obviously influenced by what we see, what we hear. Our outcomes are influenced by our own behavior. And you can kind of see your behaviors. You're doing something, you're not doing something. A lot of women, you mentioned this, we're not really into personal development as much, but we are into the career development and how many certifications can we get behind our name so we can add up all these letters because it speaks to our worth. But now mainstream, the level below that is really more mindset. And I think mindset is something that people are talking about. 15 years ago, it was a word that I don't know that everybody totally understood what that was. But I think people are actually putting too much value into mindset, because mindset's really just an attitude, right? Do you have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset? The layer below that is your limiting beliefs. And that's what you think is possible. And it's that interpretation that I talked about, like, you have an experience. Let's say you raised your hand for something at work, you felt like you couldn't provide value, and you never wanted to speak up, even though you knew you had something to offer, but you just kept telling yourself that, they're not going to want this. These are all seasoned engineers, for example. And, why would they listen to me? I'm brand new. I mean, that's that conversation going on in the head, really.
Right.
And, that comes from our experiences. It comes from what our parents told us about lots of things, not just money. I mean, we were taught to be good little girls a lot of time and give ourselves. And so women were taught that that's how we bring value, is we give ourselves until our cup is completely depleted. And
oh my goodness, is that true or what?
Yeah. And so you have to look at your limiting beliefs, but I actually think there's, two more layers. I mean, since you asked.
I did ask because I'm entirely fascinated.
Below that layer is an identity. And we start to tell ourselves, based on those experiences, based on those limiting beliefs, we start to say, I am. And, for a lot of women that I work with, I say, I am terrible with math. I suck at money. And so when that is your identity, or I am a bad mom, I mean, we have the identities like mom, your name is Shannon, that is an
Right.
identity, but it's those emotional identities that we give ourselves, kind of circle back to the emotions that really start to define our potential, because an identity tells you what's possible. I mean, if you suck at math, which again, I get women that say like, oh, I'm terrible with money. That's like an excuse. Like they don't even have to try and be good at it because they suck at it. They already know they suck at it. But yeah, women, I mean, we're cruel to ourselves and what we tell ourselves and those labels that we attach to ourselves. And even that deeper level is that starts to become wired into our brain. And so our brain is already wired to act and respond a certain way. And those are the cognitive biases that we all struggle with, man or woman, and also how our brain is wired. And so you really have to go down to a cellular level, because, I'll find people say, well, I've done personal development. I write affirmations every single day, but it's still not working because they just haven't dug deep enough really to rewire their brain from like its cellular level to start acting and being that woman that works from her strengths and positive identities. And so, I mean, there's a way to do it. It's just, I think we're at the tip of the iceberg. I mean, women, I think we're more introspective maybe. And so I think we should latch on to that beauty, that skill that we have, and just keep asking why and just keep going deeper, because you really have to sort of create alignment in all those levels of influence to really start reaching your goals consistently.
Yeah, it really makes sense on the personal role piece or the identity, because I think a lot of times we say, to your point, I am not something, like I'm just not good at money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you've never had to really practice it for whatever reason, and to your point, up until probably the last 15, 20 years, women in general haven't been the sole breadwinners of many houses. I'm sure
Yeah.
there's exceptions, but not the majority, and that is shifting.
Yeah,
In single households and in dual income households as well. That is
absolutely.
shifting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think actually now there might be, I was reading a stat the other day, and I think there's actually more female breadwinners in a dual income household where, the spouse is a male. So I thought that was actually kind of interesting, that there's a shift going on and that women hold the majority of personal wealth. But gosh, what do we do with it? I
Yeah,
mean,
it's funny because now I'm connecting a lot of dots here. So you talk about sometimes we don't have the language because we've not had to use it. You put the shame, and then you take the shame and you connect that to limiting beliefs. And man, that's just like a toxic shame storm right there,
well, it is.
ready to
And
get you, right?
yeah. And, our brain, 95% of our thoughts are subconscious. And so if your subconscious is working from a program that says, this is what's possible, this is how you should behave, this is what you deserve, this is what people think about you, it's probably not true, but it's what we tell
Right.
ourselves. When all of that is subconscious, your brain is making decisions for you that are not necessarily in your best interest. And so, putting a light on these things, don't be ashamed of it. Awareness is the most beautiful part of the journey, and being conscious of these thoughts, because when you're finally, putting these thoughts at a conscious level, you can examine them. And when you can
Yeah.
examine them, you can say, well, that's not true. and
Yeah.
I can decide to do something different. I don't have to act with that gut response. I can choose to act differently.
Yeah, it's pretty enlightening. I would say sometimes it's a little painful to get through it, but once you get through it, it's very enlightening and very freeing. That's why I
Yes.
think this conversation is so important, because I think the human race, but I'm going to talk about women here, we want to live in purpose and joy. And
Mhm.
if you want to live in purpose and joy, regardless of your wealth trajectory, you really got to be self-aware about those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, I call it the cart before the horse thinking, because a lot of people think that, when they achieve wealth, then they will feel joy. And I'm like, you have to be able to experience worth, happiness, joy you have to be able to experience that now. If you can't experience it now, what makes you think that, $10,000, $100,000 is going to make a difference? So,
Oh, that is so true. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
yeah,
Well, that was got to go in the quote section. That is so true. I mean, I think we've indicated a lot of this, but what do you think is missing in the mainstream wealth advice, specifically for women, since that's our audience?
right. Well, what's been missing is women.
Oh,
That's the
good
first
point.
ingredient.
Representation. There you go.
Representation has been missing. I think that that's changing. And so, maybe we can check that one off because it's changing. But I think a lot of the messages that women have been getting, and even maybe even misinterpreting a little bit, but I think women are taught to shrink their way to wealth. And you get online and you see all these gals talking about, oh, I cut out this and I cut out that. And they're basically bragging about how much they've cut back their living. They're basically living without. And yes, maybe they're getting ahead, they're paying their bills. But what if we took a page from, the mail book on money and talked about, like, what if we just made more? What if we didn't have to cut out our lattes? What if we didn't have to brag to each other about how cheap we are? What if we shifted the language about growth and abundance instead of just focusing on lack?
No, that is so powerful because I think women love to give back to friends and communities.
Yeah.
And one of my learnings on this journey is it can help you do the things you want to do. And that might be build a $100 million entrepreneurial business. But that also may be that I just want to be able to give back to this charity that means so much to me and my family.
Absolutely.
Or it might mean that I want to do something for my parents or somebody like that. I want to be able to support them in their old age. It may not really be related to, I just want to be a bazillionaire, right?
Yeah.
For meaning, it's very different from everyone.
Well, it is. But I mean, I've never met a person that just wants to have $10 million to literally have a pile of money in the middle of the living room. I mean, I've never met that person.
Exactly.
It's always to do something, and it's probably more than we think. I mean, if you ask, I've talked with a lot of women, right? And I ask them, why do you want this? Well, I want to be able to buy a house in a good school. Okay, well, why do you want that? Well, I mean, I want to give my kids a good education. Why is that important? Well, I mean, I want my kids to have a leg up. I mean, I don't want my kids to struggle like me. Like, that's when we start getting into the real meaning of why we want wealth. And I think when we focus on that and, putting our kids first, or being a good role model, or creating a lifestyle for our family, or just for ourselves, if we can focus on that, it makes it easier to say, what, shame or embarrassment, you're kind of an old friend and I think I've outgrown you.
Yeah, this purpose over here is a lot. She's my new BFF now. You can just go bye-bye.
Yeah, I'm kind of clear on what I want, and I'm ready to let that go. Even if it means I have to put myself out there, raise my hand. Maybe I'll be embarrassed, that I have to admit something, or maybe I ask. It's interesting because people that say, oh gosh, I'm so sorry to ask you such a stupid question. I'm like, there are no stupid questions. And that's part of finding the right community, is women that don't shame you for raising your hand and asking for help. That's how you've landed in a good place.
Yeah, which I'm going to say selfishly is this community for me. So the Empowering Women in Industry community, I've been to a lot of female related conferences in my leadership journey. And this community is the one that's really opens everybody with open arms and
That's
is
awesome.
very welcoming. So I had to do a little plug for the community. So
absolutely, you should.
Yeah. And I think, after this, maybe one of our actions, maybe we develop a virtual community within this community about people who are focused on wealth generation.
Absolutely. And, not being ashamed of it. And you mentioned, women wanting money to do good things. And what's interesting is that's one of those subconscious beliefs, is that, having wealth, I've tied labels like greed to it.
Yeah.
And so
But power in not a good sense. I actually love the word power, but we have a negative association with it.
Yeah. And so it's interesting how many people money shame people with wealth. and money shame
good
women
point.
with wealth, and money shame women that want to drive a nice car. I mean, I think if you go out there and you work hard and you want to, buy a pretty little convertible, more power to you. But I also know that women are givers, and that these women that are having, cute cars or pretty homes, great vacations, they're also giving back. Those are not mutually exclusive. And so I just think women really need to stop the shame for women that are doing well and willing to say, I'm doing well. I crossed the 7-figure mark. Let's clap, say congratulations, and teach me how to do it.
It's so funny because we talk about body shaming, right? Men or women body shaming, right? Neither is a good thing, but this is very similar. I never thought about wealth shaming. And let's say we're sitting at a stoplight and a girl rolls up in a luxury vehicle. I've never thought about, you have that thought like, oh yeah, she's one of those, right?
Oh, we do. And it's quick. Like that's that subconscious, man. It pops out a judgment before you even have a chance to blink, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to see that stop, because it shifts the conversation. It shifts the focus. I mean, money's not bad. And if you've ever had that conversation, or you've ever said to yourself, you heard about somebody that made, I don't know, like an $800,000 deal. And then they went out and spent, bought a McLaren, whatever, $250,000 car. And then we immediately start, do you know how many kids that would feed? Like we start judging them for how they spent their money. And to those folks, I say, well, then go out and make a $250,000 deal. And then you can donate $250,000 to, some organization that feeds children. Be that woman that if, you think she should spend her money that way, you don't get to decide. Make your own money, make a big pile of it, and start going out and doing good things in the world.
It's so funny you say that. So part of my, I guess, subconscious on this journey that I wasn't even aware of is I've been admitting a lot of stuff, personal things during this podcast on purpose, because I wanted people to know that it's okay to talk about things. So I'm going to admit one today. So some of the folks on here realize that I'm currently building a house, and I am ashamed to tell people the community of the house that I'm building in. So it's a really nice golf and spa community. Wow. And it's been something that, if I'm honest, I've been ashamed to admit to many people, because I felt like I was judging myself. Let's start there. And then I also felt like I would be judged by others by admitting that piece of it. Yeah. So it just recalled to me as you were having this conversation that I was judging myself. I was wealth shaming myself, and then anticipating others to follow suit to wealth shame me into it. So I'm admitting it myself, giving everybody who's listening a little bit of leeway to admit it to yourself on where you might be shaming your own self when it comes to wealth.
Well, first off, everybody, if you're listening in your car, everybody clap, for Shannon that you admitted that. That's huge. And that's a huge realization. And I can tell you right now, 100%, there's going to be somebody that's listening that's going to judge you.
Oh, sure. I know that.
You know what? I'm sorry that person feels that way. But at the end of the day, you've just given how many women permission to shoot for the stars?
Yep. And it's funny, I was driving home from this house. It's not quite done yet yesterday. And we were driving through the community. And I said to myself, you know what? I've worked really, really hard for this.
Yes.
And, I need to stop feeling so ashamed to tell people what I'm doing.
Amen. Yes. Well, you've worked hard for it. And by giving yourself, I know that you chose this community for a reason. You're building the house the way that it feels good for you. And so then you go home after a day's work and you fill your cup, and then your cup is full to then serve your community.
Yep. That's very, very true. My home is my castle, like so many people. Really curious, what common money mistakes do you see women making, if there's something we haven't talked about so far?
I would say one of the mistakes is not talking about it, but also just ignoring it. Women, maybe
that's me, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a 401k at work. So it's like, well, I checked off that box. Good. And a lot of women that I work with, they do pretty well. And so they don't need really to keep a budget that's to the penny. They're still going to put food on the table. They're still going to pay off their credit cards, or maybe pay off their credit cards. They're still going to go on vacation. So there's an ability to ignore your money. And so I just, unfortunately, I think what gets ignored over the long time, that can start to cause the problem, right? It's like if you, I guess, get a thorn in your skin and you're like, oh gosh, and I leave it, eventually it's going to get infected. So I just think women need to be more intentional in tying their goals with their earning, their income, and their management, as well as their investments, and especially investments, because most women turn over investments for whatever reason. Women, I think it's 90% of women manage the household budgets, but for whatever reason, turn over all of the investment decisions to a spouse. So I thought that was actually pretty interesting. So I think, a mistake is turning over something that's so important. It's turning over your financial future. And as much as we love our spouses now, there could be a day when you're not with that person anymore, and you need to know where your money is and how it works.
Yeah, it's actually one of the very beginnings of why I started this was, I had an issue with my rental that I talked about in a prior podcast, but I also realized that women on average live 5 years longer than men. Yeah. So there is a high probability that regardless of the success of your marriage, that you're going to find yourself at one point alone. And if you've not gotten used to the general language of money and how to manage it, and not making sure that you're ready for that point in time, it can be pretty devastating.
Absolutely. And, I'm just, for anybody that's listening, that's like, gosh, I don't think I could ever do that. It's not that hard. I mean, it's really not. You read a few blogs, you start listening to some podcasts, get some books from the library. Honestly, that's how I taught myself. You just start dipping your toe in, and then that'll start triggering some questions. And then you can get another book. Oh, well, that book answered that question. Gosh, that raised another question. Like, you can really start to create your own learning path just out of your own curiosity. But I mean, you ask what women, are doing wrong maybe with money. I think that we're not talking about it. And we think that wealth is something that's super complicated. And, it's unfortunately the industry, the financial industry really, I don't, if you work for the financial industry, I'm sorry.
My humble opinion, but
I've read some ads, and it's, the 3 deadly sins that you're committing with your money. And I was just like, why are we so biblical about all of this? Right? I mean, it's not a deadly sin. Yeah, maybe you're wasting some money, or you're paying some extra fees because you're in an expensive index fund or something. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Not the apocalypse quite yet. We're working on it, but not yet.
Take it with a grain of salt and just know that you can do it. Now, I mean, if you're somebody that's like, I'm never going to touch it, then go get a financial advisor that can help you, that really, is going to ask you good questions and align your goals with your outcomes, with your wealth.
Yeah, it's funny. Stacey Cassio, who was our first guest a couple seasons ago, one thing she's saying is stuck in my head right now, which is you often create the thing that you need. And I think this is really like leaping out of the page at me right now, because I think it's something that leaves. So when you sets their 401k and leaves it, that's me. I do put money in it. I put a decent amount every month in it, but it's been one of those things that I said, no, I'll get to it.
Yeah.
And I haven't got to it. And you just described my avatar, which would be the woman who does pretty well for herself, but kind of goes, yeah, okay, whatever. It's good. I'm good. Everything's good.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny. I did an event and I taught women how to use a financial calculator, and we were looking at, your money and what you need to live on. Like, what's the lifestyle that you want to have? Meaning, what do you not want to compromise on? What do you not want to give up? and let's figure out what that cost and let's make that the goal. Because if you know, then you've got something to work towards, but it's knowing how to, I mean, you've worked hard, you're putting money in this account. Now let's look at that account and figure out how it's going to work for you and how it's going to provide that lifestyle that you love, that's aligned with your values.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a lot about options and actions today. If I came to you and said, what's one or two things I can do, small things I can do tomorrow to start the flywheel per se, what would you tell me?
Right. Well, I honestly believe that most people, start with the intangible, which is your thoughts, your knee-jerk reactions, those emotions. I mean, you can, when something comes up, because, either that mind chatter starts or you get that, feeling in the pit of your stomach, or your chest beats a little bit faster, whatever that is, just start to pay attention to that talk in your head, those emotions. And instead of pushing them to the side, get curious. Why do I feel that way? Like, where is this coming from? Question the validity. I mean, we talk about our truths. I think most of our truths are actually beliefs, and start to look for evidence where it's not true, because that's where we start to almost coach ourselves to have a different mindset and ultimately different beliefs. So I'd say, start with the internal and that intangible, but also, don't be afraid to go to the library and check out like a basic book on investing or a basic book on retirement. Because like you said, if you start to, listen to people, to podcast, read blogs, books, you're going to be able to start asking that next question. And that's creating that learning content for yourself. And it's just being curious. So I think it's like two paths that they can go down. It's the intangible and the tangible.
Yeah. And the intangible, you're probably gonna have to go there eventually. So maybe you should start there.
Oh, absolutely. And, I'll tell you, people come to me like, I just need a budget. 70% of people don't keep a budget. So
I don't. I told you part of this journey was me telling on myself because I wanted to create a safe space for people to do the same. Yeah.
And so so how do we work with somebody that doesn't want to keep a budget, right? I mean, there's ways that you don't have to keep a budget and you can still be intentional with your money. So I don't know. I think just be super curious and start figuring out what works for you. But don't be afraid to have the conversation. Men have these conversations a lot of times out on the golf course, and we don't. When we get together, we're talking about our kids or our families or, maybe our jobs, but we don't typically talk about what we're doing around wealth. So it's just,
and we're going to change that.
I hope so.
We're going to change that.
Absolutely.
Well, Amy, this has been such an amazing conversation. I really appreciate it. I have one final question. Is there any final piece of advice you would give for a woman in this community?
I would. And here's what I'm going to say. I talked about that identity, and we have like these emotional attachments, these things that we call ourselves. What I'm going to tell you is whatever that label is, that's not who you are. And really start to separate that identity from your actual essence of who you are. You're just a person having angry thoughts or thoughts of resentment or thoughts of shame. You're a person having those thoughts. But when we realize that we're not that person and that identity is not us, and we can kind of separate ourselves away from that and say, okay, well, then what thoughts do I want to have? Where do I want to operate from? And, just choosing something, where you can operate from strength. Like, what is that identity that's powerful to you? And so you're not those labels, ladies, and like, let go of that. And gentlemen as well. I mean,
this applies both ways. I'm focusing on women because that's our majority of our listeners, but it can apply either
90% of my clients are women as well. Like it's, a smaller percentage are men, or like a lot of times it's couples, right? Like a woman comes and then I end up coaching the spouse as well. But
and there are men out there that aren't good with money. Let's be clear. This is not a female
100%.
problem. Let me be really clear.
And we're turning over decisions, our future, our financial future, to people that really don't know what they're doing. And I can tell you, I've had a lot of men come to me and say, like, I'm so ashamed. Like, like we're losing money. I don't know what I'm doing. My wife is, asked me to take care of all of this. And I mean, I don't know anything about money or investments.
I could see that'd be a totally separate set of challenges, especially with our breadwinner socialized mindset for men. It'd be really embarrassing or shameful for them to say they know nothing, because that's supposed to be part of their societal role. I could see that being really hard.
Well, and I think that maybe that's why I attract men that coach women mostly, because it feels more like a safe space.
Yeah. Because they're like, okay, you're not going to judge me.
I think so. Yeah.
Yep. Well, Amy, this has been fascinating. I want more people to find you. So can you tell me where folks could find you online, social media, et cetera?
Yeah. So my social media handles are at Live the Capital Life. And my website is Amy Westbrook with no E, amywestbrook.com. And I was going to tell you too, if people will go to amywestbrook.com/podcast, I'll have a little micro course where women continue to just ask themselves like these deeper questions and get curious. Because I know that if I can help people build awareness, I know I can create change. So it's my little give back to your audience for having me.
Thank you so much, Amy. This has been absolutely amazing. You've got my interest peaked now because I've done a lot of personal development, but not in this realm. And clearly I'm creating the conversation community that I need. So you've given me a lot of blessing today. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, audience, that's it for now. We will talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.